Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast number 97. I'm Jim Cornell and this is the weekly podcast from Labiotech. Today we're talking about something that will likely affect many of us at some point in our lives. I know it's already happened to me, and that's hearing loss. When it comes to the numbers, it's kind of staggering, as by 2050, nearly 2.5 billion people will have some degree of hearing loss, and at least 700 million will require some kind of intervention. While you can get hearing aids, there aren't really too many other options, but Rinri Therapeutics is looking to change all that. Today on the podcast we have a conversation with Rinri CEO Simon Chandler about hearing loss, what's being done to tackle it, and Rinri's novel approach to treatments.
To get things started then, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the history of the company.
Rinri Therapeutics formed in 2019, originally as a spin-out from the University of Sheffield in the UK, and it was really based off the research that had been conducted by the lab of Marcelo Revolta, who's a professor of sensory stem cells and hearing at the University of Sheffield. And it's really a culmination of 25 to almost 30 years of his work, really, in developing potential therapeutic modalities, therapeutic options for hearing loss. We were spun out with money and funding from Boehringer Ingelheim Venture Fund, UCB Ventures and Audley Park Ventures, who kind of saw the possibilities that were inherent in what Marcelo had done in his research. And then I suppose in the last almost 5 years now, we have been taking that research and moving it closer and closer towards patients and the clinic. And that's really what the purpose of Rinri is to be a vehicle for that transition and that movement.
It's funny you mentioned that the company was started in 2019 and people would think it's a very new company, but then you mention about how it's based on 30 years of research. So it's kind of a little bit misleading sometimes when it looks like a new company.
Yes, we're standing very much on the shoulder of scientific giants in that sense. But ultimately, therapeutic development takes a long time. It takes decades, on average, to take a discovery from an R&D setting and get it authorized and prescribed to a patient. It's a hugely long process. And that's even more accentuated when you're looking at advanced therapies, looking at the cutting edge of modalities like cell therapies, gene therapies, and RNA therapies, which are obviously kind of infamous or famous from the recent COVID times. And these things usually take a very long time to get through. It's all the regulatory hurdles that you need to abide by to make sure these things are going to be safe when you implant them into or deliver them into humans. And it just takes a long time.
I wonder if you have any background or maybe even some stats on hearing loss. And also, I guess it's more than just one thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Hearing loss as a whole, as a totality, is a vast global problem. And arguably, humans are in the midst of a global hearing loss pandemic, really. There's some really interesting kind of startling facts from WHO that kind of indicate that there are currently 1.5 billion people in the world with some form of hearing loss. And that's going to rise to 2.5 billion by 2050. And of those, nearly 500 million, like 500 million of those have what's called disabling hearing loss. So this is hearing loss so severe that it affects their day-to-day life and impacts their abilities to, I suppose, take full participation in society. So it reduces education prospects, employment prospects, and really has untreated hearing loss has direct impacts to mental health decline. And importantly, now it's been realized has a direct link to cognitive declines and particularly to dementia. So one of the highest modifiable risks, or the most highest modifiable risks for you developing dementia in later life, is treatment of hearing loss. So if somebody does not treat their hearing loss, they are many more times more likely to get dementia than somebody who doesn't have hearing loss or treats their hearing loss. So they're the kind of stats. It's a very big problem. And these numbers are on a par with conditions like osteoarthritis and diabetes, and have equal macroeconomic costs and microeconomic costs to countries and healthcare systems. But I suppose the amazing thing is that no disease-modifying therapeutic has ever been approved for hearing loss. So it's an amazing white space that's there to develop something which can have real impact for patients, both in the short term and their long term prospects.
Yeah, you mentioned mental health, and I guess it's something that has only really come to the forefront in maybe the past decade or so, where people will actually talk about it. Is there the same kind of stigma about hearing loss? Because I think that a long time ago, people just accepted it as a fact of aging.
I think people do accept it as a fact of aging, and that's one of the biggest causes of hearing loss is aging, just a natural consequence of getting older. But in terms of its stigma, I think that's very much still there, particularly when you consider the current standard of care is limited to external medical devices like hearing aids and cochlear implants. There is for sure a stigma associated to having a visible external indicator of your hearing loss and the negative consequences of that. I think that does impact the uptake of these devices for sure. People get prescribed hearing aids, they get prescribed cochlear implants, but then do not use them because they don't want to be labelled as having hearing loss, because that has other consequences to people's perception of them, which is unfair. It's just their hearing that's gone, not they have any other cognitive issues, but that's the stigma that gets associated to it. I think the mental health aspect that we were referring to before is often a consequence of withdrawal from society and social environment. So what has been found is that as people get harder of hearing, as they progressively get more deaf, it gets harder and harder for people to hear speech, particularly in noisy backgrounds. There's a whole cliche of the cocktail party effect. That environment where you've got this hubbub of noise around you becomes harder and harder to work in and live in and hear people's conversations. So what people tend to do as a consequence of that is just not go to those environments. So they don't go to work, they don't go to social gatherings, they don't interact. And then that has the direct consequence of people not socially interacting and therefore not having interactions, and humans being social beings. That has a mental health impact. It's a relatively simple sequence of events, but it's a big one because lots of people have hearing loss that's just not treated at the moment or adequately treated.
What's the difference between sensorineural hearing loss, conductive hearing loss, and mixed hearing loss, and the treatments?
Absolutely. So, very basically, hearing is dealt with by the ear in humans. And obviously, sound goes down the outer ear and hits the middle ear bones, the famous kind of stapes, incus, malleus bones, which effectively translate the vibrations of air via the tympanic membrane into vibrations in the fluid in a specialized organ called the cochlea. And the cochlea contains specialist sensory cells which convert those vibrations in fluid within the ear into electrical signals. So if you have conductive hearing loss, that is an issue with the outer and middle ear, so the conduction of the sound through air. And then you have sensorineural hearing loss, which is the death or damage to the specialized sensory cells within the cochlea. So that's what we term sensorineural hearing loss. In terms of relative frequency or incidence of these types of conditions, approximately and very crudely, 10% of all hearing loss is conductive and about 90% is sensorineural. So most of the problems that people have is with the sensory cells within the cochlea. The conductive hearing loss is relatively well dealt with by microsurgery now, but the sensorineural hearing loss is less well treated. In terms of the contribution of sensorineural hearing loss aspects, so within the cochlea, you've got these sensory cells called hair cells or auditory neurons. And these two types of cells have different roles within the hearing kind of pathway. The hair cells effectively detect the movements of the vibrations in the fluid within the cochlea. They're mechanotransducers, so they just move in relation to those vibrations and send electrical signals basically through those cells to the auditory neurons, which then relay those signals to the brain. So if you lose either of those two types of cells, you're basically losing a component of your hearing pathway, and therefore you lose your hearing. The treatments for sensorineural hearing loss is limited to only the hair cells at the moment. So both hearing aids and cochlear implants really only deal with the damage to the hair cells. Hearing aids are very clever sound processors and translators. They optimize the sound going into the tympanic membrane so that you can use what you've got left in a better way. But cochlear implants effectively bypass the damaged hair cells to directly stimulate the auditory neurons. The consequence of this is that if you have neural hearing loss, which is what Rinri Therapeutics is focusing on initially, these devices don't really help because they rely on an intact neural architecture there to actually work. So patients are currently prescribed these devices at the moment, but they're not that effective if you have a predominantly kind of neural basis to your hearing loss.
Does the timing of when somebody goes to get hearing aids, I guess, does the timing of that impact on it? If somebody were to be treated or the hearing loss acknowledged earlier along the line, would that make any difference?
Absolutely. I think the earlier you are diagnosed with hearing loss and what kind of hearing loss you have, and you have an intervention, the better. I think going right to the extremes, children they try to diagnose children with hearing loss as early as possible, prelingually, because if you can't hear, you can't develop language skills. And once that kind of window of opportunity is gone, then it's very hard to then gain those language skills. Even for older people, so people with age-related hearing loss or even acquired hearing loss, it would appear that the longer that you have that profound hearing loss, the harder it is to recover that or to treat that with the devices. And we presume it will be the same for therapeutics, such as Rinri Therapeutics are developing. And the rule of thumb is if somebody's had severe to profound hearing loss for over 10 years, then it becomes really quite challenging to do something with that. So the earlier people can get into primary care, get referred on to ENT and audiology, the better the prognosis will be. Absolutely.
A nice segue into what you're doing there. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the OSPREY platform and Rincell 1.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are no therapeutic treatments, no regenerative therapies for any type of hearing loss. There are only palliative medical devices, which effectively deal with the symptoms of hearing loss. Neural hearing loss in particular has no devices that can treat them. Obviously, then the consequence of that is that these patients aren't being adequately treated, and therefore the long-term consequences that I mentioned about mental health and cognitive decline are not being tempered by their treatments. So the way Rinri thinks about sensorineural hearing loss is that it's a cellular problem. So it's the death or damage to these sensory cells. And we believe, our hypothesis is that the best way to treat this is to replace the damaged cells with functional cells. It's almost like a cell transplant. It's a transplant of a functional cell population to restore what was there before. Think of it like an organ transplant, replacing that functional capability. What we are developing at Rinri are regenerative cells. So these are cells which are some way in between a pluripotent state, so a stem cell, and the mature auditory sensory cell state. So they're kind of this intermediate state, which is semi-differentiated, but not fully differentiated. And we create these cells by using the OSPREY technology, which is effectively a developmentally informed differentiation method, which mimics the growth factors and signaling which occurs in the developing embryo, which is where these cells originate naturally in humans. And we replicate that in vitro, basically in a petri dish, in a flask, using the same signaling mechanisms in the same order, in the same way, to recapitulate that sequence and therefore develop these functional progenitor cells. And that's, in a nutshell, the concept. And then these cells are transplanted in and they can complete their maturation in the right environment, getting the right signals from the native cochlea and complete that development and effectively reconnect the hearing system together.
The cochlea is quite difficult to access, though. How do you address that?
Yes, it is. It is notoriously difficult to access compared to the people in ophthalmology, looking at the eye, or, people who can deliver drugs systemically through, IV. They have a much easier time of accessing their site of administration than we do. So yes, the cochlea is behind the temporal bone, which is the hardest bone in the human body. For us to get access to the cochlea, we need to get through that bone. What we have decided to do at Rinri, particularly for our initial clinical studies, is piggyback, for want of a better term, on the back of the cochlear implant surgical procedure, because this is a routine way in which the cochlea is accessed in patients now who are receiving a cochlear implant. It's routine, it's safe, and actually we found we only need to do a minor modification of that process to actually access the site of administration for our therapy, which was very similar to what we use in our non-clinical models. We've done this by building a consortium, an international consortium of ENT surgeons from the University of Nottingham, Guy's and St Thomas's, Uppsala in Sweden, and also Western University in Canada. to actually develop this solution to get access to the cochlea. And what they did is they developed a 3D model of the cochlea using synchrotron imagery. They were able to put all the slices back together to create this 3D model, which the surgeons were then able to use to effectively explore different routes of access to the site of administration, this base of the nerve canal of the cochlea, avoiding any risky structures like nerves and arteries in the process, and then take that on to do validation in kind of donated cadaveric material. And we've now done that. We actually published a paper back in the end of 2023 in Nature, showing this for the first time, that we were able to access this space and that we could deliver cells to that space in human material. We've since developed that further, and we've trained more scientists, actually, as well as surgeons in this process. And we're now writing the surgical manual ready for our clinical trials next year.
When you're talking about the treatment, is it a cure, i.e. does it reverse the loss, or does it just stop it from deteriorating?
So it's a really good question. I think as a modality, as a concept, we are looking to replace the cells which are deficient or damaged or dead in the cochlea. And therefore, it is a solution that has the potential to have broad application to the sensorineural hearing loss kind of patient community, kind of independent of the etiology, the cause of the hearing loss, or the residual characteristics of that particular patient's cochlea, and replace a functional population of cells. I suppose this differs quite substantially to some of the other therapies that have been developed in this area. So particularly the gene therapies, which have been having quite a bit of noise recently. The two US companies, Decibel and Acuos, who've got solutions for a particular monogenic condition, otoferlin, which is great, absolutely great for the patients, but it's really only 20,000 patients in the world that have this issue. So it's never going to treat the big problem of age-related hearing loss and acquired hearing loss. So in that sense, to emphasize, I think what we have is potentially a broad application. Our preclinical data, so this is transplanting our cells into a model of the condition, a rodent model of the condition, suggests that it has the potential to be transformative to patients. So we can restore hearing in the model of auditory neuropathy. We are focusing on auditory neuropathy, neural hearing loss initially. We can restore hearing in those models by about 25 decibels, which would be transformative to patients. It would take them from being profoundly to almost totally deaf to being able to have a conversation like we're having now. So in a practical sense, it would be very useful for these patients on a day-to-day basis and help ameliorate many of the things we've been talking about before in terms of social interactions and engagement with society, etc., and also offsetting the potential development of dementias. But whether it would restore all hearing remains to be seen. And I think that's why we need to go to clinical trials, because there's only so far you can take any model of any condition, especially a sensory condition, which is a very human thing where there are no real biomarkers. You don't have a genetic marker for how well you're hearing. Can you hear classical music? Can you hear somebody speaking in a particular accent? All these things which are very human, we have to go to humans to find out really where they're going. And actually that brings me on to another potential benefit of what we're doing, is that there are solutions, as I mentioned, for hair cell loss, the cochlear implants and hearing aids, but there are a lot of frustrations from the patient populations because these devices are great, but they deliver unnatural hearing to patients. They're very robotic, metallic noises, very alien noises to actually hear. So what patients actually want is a natural hearing back. So the hearing that you and I have, and hypothetically, by restoring the biological mechanism of hearing with a cell therapy, should, in principle, hopefully restore more natural hearing than the devices. Again, we won't know until we've done clinical trials and been into patients. But again, that's a potential, another benefit, as well as restoring absolute hearing, which we obviously want to do. It's potentially more nuanced as well.
I was just thinking about that as you were talking about it in terms of the restoration of hearing. Would this be something that, just as an example, if somebody was in their late 40s and had this done because their hearing was damaged through music or whatever, clearly as we age, it deteriorates anyway. Do you think that this is something that you would need to redo at certain points in the future, or would once be enough?
Our vision, our hope is that this would be a one-time treatment. Certainly, again, in preclinical models, the data we have would indicate that this has the potential to be a very long-term solution for restoring hearing loss. But again, I just want to caution that statement with the fact that we are looking at a xenograft model, a preclinical model. There are many differences to the human condition. But if you take a few leaps of faith on that and say, yes, the model is very equivalent to humans, then there is potential for a very long term, at least decades long restoration of hearing using this therapy. However, if this case was that it wasn't a permanent solution and they did degrade over time, then there is precedence in ENT surgery for doing revision surgery on cochlear implants. So yes, theoretically, you could redeliver a population of cells back into the patient and effectively, I suppose, top up or restore the hearing back again. So I think both avenues are there. Our vision clearly is to go for the one-time solution. That's what we'd like to do.
You mentioned a couple of companies doing other means of addressing this. Are there many others addressing this?
At the beginning of this conversation, we mentioned the white space, as I call it, in hearing loss. This is a massive condition. And you'd think that pharma companies and biotechs would have spotted this opportunity a very long time ago. And it's not the case, really, that the world is full of technologies and companies developing solutions for hearing loss, therapeutic solutions for hearing loss. And I think there's only been 20 to 30 companies and projects ever since the history of time developing therapeutic solutions for hearing loss. Most of those have been really focused on otoprotection. So that's stopping things getting worse. Once you kind of identify you've had a toxic event, a toxic shock. And very few have taken on the developmental issue or the restorative issue of a therapeutic. So I mentioned the gene therapies, and they're great. I mean, absolutely fantastic news. It's now 5 companies developing gene therapies for otoferlin. Absolutely brilliant. Restoring hearing in children who otherwise would never have heard anything is a fantastic result. But as I mentioned, it's a relatively small patient population, tens of thousands in total, compared to hundreds of millions for the problem in hearing loss. There are companies looking at the hair cells, looking at attenuating some of the hair cells. So a kind of a sister company of ours, Acousia, also funded by Boehringer Ingelheim, are looking at that kind of aspect using a novel chemical entity, so a small molecule approach. And there were a couple of companies looking at transdifferentiation, which is the ability to try and change the type of cell in the ear into another type of cell in vivo. So basically turning a supporting cell into a hair cell in this case. A couple of companies called Frequency Therapeutics. There's one company who's very prominent in that. Great science on the lab bench, but didn't translate in vivo. So they're no longer pursuing that particular aim. In terms of our approach, the cell therapy approach, we're pretty much the only ones doing this and pioneering it. And the reason is not because we're the only ones kind of crazy enough to try it. It is quite a difficult thing to do. It's a logical thing to do, and academics have been trying to do the cellular approach for 20 or 30 years, really since the advent of stem cell technologies. But it's proved difficult to create the cells which are functional in vivo. And that's what we have at Rinri Therapeutics. That's the unique capabilities that we have, is to make these cells which not only look right, have the right markers, but actually when you put them into an organism, they actually function as you expect them to do. And that's what we're doing. And we're targeting neural hearing loss first, and we want to move on after that to other parts of the hearing loss pathway.
I guess one of the things that is associated with hearing loss is that we talked about it earlier, that it's just a natural part of aging. But then you mentioned those connections to dementia. So clearly there's a bigger economic cost than one would initially expect. What is the economics of what you're doing? I mean, is it a costly procedure?
I mean, in terms of economics of the therapy, all advanced therapies in the early stages of their development have a price tag. I mean, it won't be a surprise to you or to your listeners, the gene therapies out there, you've got $1 to $4 million per dose. They're very, very high levels. So I think ATPs always come with a higher cost than small or large molecules just by their inherent complexity. But I think what we have at Rinri is a process which is inherently robust and scalable. And whilst at the early stages of development, we're at a very low scale, so costs tend to be relatively high, we are very cognizant of the big problem in hearing loss. Also, the democratization of therapies for hearing loss is very important to us. So we are very keen on continuing to explore how we control costs, how we bring costs down in the future, so that we can roll this out should it be successful, to not just the most wealthy countries in the world and not just the wealthiest people in those countries as well, but to everybody who could benefit from it, because that's the only way in which, as you mentioned, the bigger macroeconomic costs that are impacting countries around the world can be dealt with by treating, not just tens or hundreds of patients, but hundreds of thousands of patients. And the only way you can do that without bankrupting healthcare systems is by pulling the price down. We clearly can't be charging £4 million a dose for this. So we don't know what it will be yet, but it's certainly an important thing to us and our investors that it's accessible. And I said, we are looking at scaling to enable that access in the future.
But then, as you mentioned, if dementia is a side product of hearing loss, then there's also that secondary economic cost of families having to look after elderly family members with hearing loss. And so it's more than just the person that's got the issue.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting point you make there. So you see these numbers being banded around quite a lot in many indications about what's the economic cost of this indication. I think the last estimates I saw for hearing loss were in the $1 trillion a year globally. These numbers are very hard to validate where they come from and what they really mean. And interestingly enough, when you do health economics and market access calculations, you don't really include the secondary effects, the wider macro effects of a condition on individuals, their families, or economies. And I think it's something personally which does need to be done, particularly for these conditions like hearing loss, to really understand the value potential of these hearing loss. Yeah, we can do the standard health economics model looking at an individual patient and what they would gain in terms of their quality of life, the quality of life adjusted year calculations, that's fine, but it doesn't really capture the bigger societal consequences of these conditions. But at the moment, it's not something which is routinely done. And, actually, Rinri is looking to work with organisations like the Bioindustry Association to start looking at some of these questions, because you've got other sensory conditions being looked at with ATMP. So I've mentioned ophthalmology already, and they obviously do have somewhat higher costs than conventional medicines, but they do have potentially bigger impacts and bigger value propositions than are currently captured. So we do need to start looking towards that as a governments, internationally. And I think hopefully hearing loss could be a way to lead that going forwards.
What's your timeline like? I know you mentioned you were looking to move into clinical trials soon.
Yeah, timelines are that we are presently in what I call either a late preclinical phase or near clinical phase, depending on which way you want to look at it from. But in reality, we are this year finishing off the final regulatory approval dataset packages, so what we call CTA enabling, because we're looking at doing the first in-human study in the UK under the MHRA, so that would be a CTA, a clinical trial authorization. We'll be finishing 2 major pieces of work this year, which will enable us to file our CTA early 2025. And we have been working very closely with our clinical sites already, so that we are quite confident that should we get the CTA, we'll be moving into first in human in kind of half one 2025. So pretty much this time next year. And our top line data will be out halfway through 2027, with possibility of some early readouts earlier than that as well, to give us indications of more rapid clinical benefits and establishing that clinical proof of concept sooner. So we're really trying to accelerate through this first in human clinical trial, this phase 1/2A, which will enable us then to clearly raise more money to take us into later stage clinical trials and get it to patients quicker.
Are there any other things that are in your pipeline that you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're always going to be a hearing loss company. We're focused on that. But what we're looking to do is look at other aspects of hearing loss as we develop. So, as I mentioned, sensorineural hearing loss is caused by the death or damage to the auditory neurons or the auditory hair cells. We're initially focusing on the auditory neurons. So Rincell 1 is our lead product, and that is an ES-derived population of human otic neural progenitor cells. So that's Rincell 1, that's looking at treating neural hearing loss. We've then got an early pipeline product called Rincell 2, which is looking at deriving the same population of cells, but from iPS cells rather than ES cells. So these are somatically derived cells. What this enables us to do is look at a second generation of this first product, which could take advantage of the new generation of iPS cells, so the hypoimmune cells, which would give rise to a universal treatment without the need for any even short-term immune suppression for patients, either in trials or later dates. So that's a real angle we want to pursue. And then Rinri 3, third product, is a stem cell derived otic epithelial progenitor cell population, and these are the progenitors of the auditory hair cells, so the other part of the hearing loss problem. So the idea is that we are developing solutions for all of sensorineural hearing loss, and that's what we're kind of pushing forwards. But our focus, at least in the near term, is to push Rinri 1, the first generation of the neural progenitor therapy, through to clinical proof of concept first. And then once we've done that, then we can reignite and accelerate the pipeline products going forwards. That's our commercial strategy or our research strategy to do that.
Hearing loss is definitely something that so many people have or will need to address as they get older, so it's good to hear an overview of just how this massive problem can potentially be tackled. Don't forget to check out the latest news and articles over at Labiotech.eu, and I hope wherever in the world you are, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.